Good morning. If you would open up your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3. This morning I wanted to start off just by telling you a short story and reminding you of what we talked about last week. But tonight we're going to be sharing our experiences about Mexico and what we saw there. But I wanted to share just a short story with you about something that happened while we were there. I shared it with the teens last week, and I actually meant to use it as my introduction last week and totally slipped my mind, and I took off and went a whole nother direction. So it's interesting how you can do that sometimes and totally forget something. But while we were in Mexico, there were two children that ended up coming to the children's home that were going to be placed inside of the children's home that would be staying there from that point forward. And if you can imagine that situation and what that was like, many of the children who come to the children's home come from a background that's very difficult. Not all of them do, but quite a few of them come from a background that's very, very hard. One where their trust has been taken advantage of, and one where they come in basically fighting almost for their lives. While we were there, we had two children that came in, and one of them, as he was coming in, was very defiant. Just yelling at the staff, he was hitting at the staff. He did not want to be there. It was very evident that he did not want to be with these people. And Gil talked to us a little bit about it. That's the man who's the director over the children's home. And he discussed with us just how many of these kids, when they come into the children's home, they are in such an environment that they are just trying to survive. They've been neglected. They've not always had what they've needed. The parents were not always there for them. And so they come into the children's home totally just defiant, fighting for their lives, looking for some way to get out of the situation that they're in and let people know that they are there and that they are capable of taking care of themselves. But he talked to us about how with them losing their trust, the most important thing was for them to regain that trust. And he talked about how pouring water upon a rock, that over time, just with a drip even, that eventually that rock will wear away, that it will wear down, and it will get to the center of that rock. It will cause an area of it to be carved out. And he talked about it's the same way with these children that come in. They need the love of Jesus poured out in their life on a constant basis. And it will take a long time sometimes to regain that trust of pouring it into their life, just slowly dripping the love of Jesus into them before they can come to trust the people that are around them who claim to be followers of Jesus. I think about trust, and we talked about trust last week, about trusting God and how important it is for us to know that we can trust God, know that we can depend on Him. In my lesson, I talked about that He is faithful. He's always truthful. He loves us. He does not change. He knows everything, He's always present, and He's all-powerful. He is somebody that we can depend on. We know that His character is one that we can depend on. We know that He also has the power and the ability to do the things that He says that He can do. And so we know that we can put our trust in Him, and we know that that relationship is one that we can value and that we should desire. God desires a relationship with each and every one of us. He desires for us also to be faithful to Him. He says in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13, that although sometimes we are not faithful, that He is always faithful. And He will always be faithful to us. And we mess that up time and time again. But yet He still wants a relationship with us. He desires that relationship, and He desires for us to depend on Him, to trust Him, and to put our faith in Him. Hebrews 11, chapter 11, verse 6, we read that this morning. It says, without faith it is impossible to please God. We have to have faith in order to find favor in God. Look at Proverbs chapter 3, I ask you to open up to. Proverbs chapter 3. It's very interesting because Hebrews chapter 10, 11, and 12, I find the passages fitting together with Proverbs chapter 3 so well. Even in Hebrews chapter 12 this morning, if you look at 5 and 6, it quotes Proverbs chapter 3 at one point. But these two chapters talk about faith. In Proverbs chapter 3, you have a father giving advice to a son. And many of us, as many of you fathers who have sent your child out into this world, probably can reflect on this passage and connect to it instantly. I think even our mothers can connect to this part too. But it's a father speaking to a son. And I want you to listen to it for just a second. It's his advice that he's giving to his son. And I think about this is something that we would probably give to our children as we're sending them out into the world. He says this, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart, for they will prolong your life many years and bring you prosperity. Let love and faithfulness never leave you. Bind them around your neck and write them on the tablets of your heart. Then you will find favor and a good name in the sight of God and man." Don't forget what you've been taught. That's what you would tell one of your children, right? When you're sending them out into the world, when you're getting ready to let them be on their own, remember what I've taught you. Even sometimes when you drop them off at school, right? You're getting ready to do that here pretty soon. You'll remind them, don't forget who we've taught you to be. Be the person that we have taught and instilled inside of you. And so he reminds his son. He says, keep the commands in your heart. Remember the things that we've taught you because they will bring many years to your life and bring you prosperity. But then he names two things after this. He says, let love and faithfulness never leave you. Love and faithfulness. Two very important things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? The greatest command that Jesus gives is to love. To love him, first of all, and to love your neighbor second. And so he tells you that faithfulness and love are two very important things. Bind them around your neck. When you think about something that's around your neck, it doesn't come off very easily, right? When you put a necklace on, the only time it comes off is when that clasp comes undone. But bind that around your neck and write it on the tablets of your heart. Love and faithfulness should go everywhere with you. Everywhere you go, that should be something that is on your heart, on your mind, and what you're trying to achieve in your life is being faithful to him and loving him every step and every way. It says if you want to find favor with God even, that you must have love and you must have faithfulness. And that's where Hebrews 11 comes in. Without faithfulness, it is impossible to please him. And so I started looking at this particular passage, and I want us to continue reading because I think these next parts are how we put love and faithfulness of our Father inside of us. So verse 5, he says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine." Verse 11 is the part of Hebrews chapter 12 even. We're not going to go into that section, but I look at this first part, love and faithfulness. Love and faithfulness to our God come by us trusting him. Love and faithfulness come about through us trusting in him, putting our trust in him, knowing that we can depend on him, not doubting him, not being afraid, but saying, I know God will take care of me. He says also, don't lean on your own understanding. Don't lean on the things that you know are right in this world, but lean on what he says is truth. Depend upon his word and lean upon it. You think about where does faith come from? In Romans chapter 10, verse 17, it says, faith comes through the words of Christ. Right? Faith comes through listening to the word of God. I think about that, and one of the things that's really inspired me lately is there's so many times that I try to become dependent upon what I think is truth. I rely on what other people tell me. I rely on the truth that people speak around me instead of relying upon God's word. But I think about how important it is for us to listen to his word and know the things that he says are true. Because when we do that, when we come into times of trouble and we begin having Satan pouring in all of these messages into our life, we have to remember what God's word says is truth and depend upon it. There's been some situations in Nancy's and in my life and Nancy's that I think about, that sometimes we listen to all the chatter that's going on around us. And we listen to what the world is telling us. But there's so many times that God didn't promise the things that we think that we deserve. And we start listening to the world telling us, you deserve this, you deserve that. Instead of listening to what God says and says, this is what I've promised for you. One of the areas I hesitate to speak on it, but I'm going to anyways because I feel called on saying it. You know, one of the blessings of us going to the children's home for Nancy and I was to be around all those babies. And, you know, we've had a lot of miscarriages over the years. And I think about how hard that is. But one of the blessings that I think about, and mothers forgive me because I'm a man and I don't know all the right words to say in this situation. But God never promised me to have 3 kids. He never promised me to have the 2 that I have. But I think about the blessing that I've received in that. God has been faithful to me through everything that I have lived. And so many people in this world, you look around the world and you think, we deserve that. We deserve those things. We deserve the things that God talks about. But do we? Did God promise that? Not necessarily. God does promise to take care of us and does promise to bless us. What a blessing it is to have those promises. But we have to rely on his word through those times of hardship, through those times of just inadequacy in our life, of not knowing how to handle, not knowing what to do. The other part of it is, in all your ways, acknowledge him. Acknowledge him. Acknowledge that he is present, that he is there, and give your problems over to him. In this situation, it has 3 things here. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him. Trust him, lean on him, and acknowledge him. I think about the disciples, and the title of this lesson is A Journey of Faith. A journey of faith. This doesn't happen just with us making a decision today, just all of a sudden, and then everything is good from then on out. It's a daily thing. It's daily deciding that we are going to get up and follow him and give him these things. Daily, I'm going to trust in him. I'm going to lean on him, and I'm going to give him the things of this world, whether they're good or whether they're bad. I'm going to lean on him and listen to him. But I think about our journey and how hard it is, and how much of a struggle it is at times. If you would, open up to Matthew chapter 8. Matthew chapter 8, verse 23. I was thinking about the disciples' lives in all of this, and I think this proves a great point. In looking at their journey, looking at what they went through and what they did. And I'm going to tie all of this back to Proverbs here in a little bit about trusting in Him, leaning on Him, and acknowledging Him. And so I looked at their lives and their call. In Matthew chapter 4, you have Simon and Andrew, James and John being called. They're fishermen, right? And you have two different occasions where Jesus comes up to them and says, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And what do? They drop everything. They drop their nets. They leave everything behind them, and they follow Jesus. Step of faith? I would say so, wouldn't you? They left everything that they knew, their jobs, everything that would be comfortable, staying with their family, and they drop it, and they leave, and they go with Him. Huge step of faith. Even in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, it has Matthew, the tax collector, when Jesus comes up to him and tells him to follow him, he gets up and he goes. You think about the disciples and what they were willing to do, and the steps of faith that they took along the way, their journey of faith. But yet, so many times, I spoke of this last week, we see this phrase, "you of little faith." There's 5 different times that I see this within the Gospels, where they say, "you of little faith." 4 of them are dealing with the disciples. The 5th one is Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, where He's preaching to them, do not worry about your life as to what you will eat, what you will wear, and to what you will drink. Don't worry about your life. But he talks to them about their clothing and says, "You of little faith, trust me." But then the next 4 deal with the disciples' trust in Him. And that's what we have here in Matthew chapter 8, verse 23. You see Jesus calming the storm. The disciples and Jesus, after a long day of healing people, they get into the boat and they begin crossing the sea. And as they're crossing the sea, a huge storm rises up. Where's Jesus? He's asleep in the stern, right? Hard day, long day, and He's asleep. But all the disciples are panicked. They're worried. Waves are coming in. The boat is basically sinking. They're very disturbed by everything that's going on. So what do? They go down to Jesus and say, "Don't you care? Don't you care? We're going to die." And Jesus gets up. And He asks this, he makes this statement. He says, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Why are you so afraid? It says the men were amazed after this. They were amazed at this, and they asked this question: "Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey His will?" But then you flip over to Matthew chapter 14, and you have the next statement of "you of little faith." Matthew chapter 14, you see it in verse 31. Jesus has just finished feeding the 5,000. And if you remember that story, Jesus basically takes a small boy's 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and multiplies it and feeds 5,000 people. Pretty amazing story, right? But then Jesus goes off, He's by Himself, and His disciples are out in the boat, and it becomes nighttime, and the boat's off a distance out in the water. And so Jesus gets up, and he goes to His disciples walking on the water, but they see Him, and they become terrified, right? They think it's even a ghost, and Jesus says, "It's me." And Peter says, "If it's you, then tell me to come to you." And Jesus says, "Come." And so Peter steps out of the boat, and he begins walking on the water. Pretty amazing story right there in of itself. But then he sees the waves coming at him, and he begins to doubt. And he begins to sink. And Jesus reaches out His hand, and here's what He says. He says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" They then worshiped Him and said, "Truly you are the Son of God," after seeing that. And I think about these 2 situations. So far, you've had 2 questions. Why are you so afraid? Why did you doubt? But then Matthew chapter 16. This actually starts in chapter 15, but go ahead and flip over to chapter 16. This is the feeding of the 4,000. You had the feeding of the 5,000 already take place, where everybody's fed off of 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. Pretty amazing story, right? But now you have all of these people. You have 4,000 people, and they're fed by just a few loaves of bread again and just a few small fish. Another amazing story. Just to witness this account taking place and seeing it, our minds would be blown by this taking place, right? We would think that this was pretty amazing. But they go away from this situation, and Jesus has an encounter with the Pharisees at the end of him feeding these people. And the Pharisees began testing Jesus. And Jesus later tells his disciples, he says, "Be careful, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." But their response to this situation, if you remember it, they're worried. Because what did they do? They forgot the bread. They forgot the bread. How important is bread? Not very important when you think about the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. They've already forgotten what Jesus has done just a few minutes before all of this has taken place. But they argue amongst themselves, and they think it's the bread that they forgot, that they left behind. But listen to what Jesus says to them in verse 8. He says, aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, "You of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves? The five loaves for the 5,000, and how many basketfuls you gathered?" You see, he retells the story of what he's done, of about the 5,000. He also retells it of the 4,000. But his question here is, don't you remember? Don't you remember what I have done? I like what he says in Mark chapter 8, verse 17 of the same account. He says, "Do you still not see or understand? Do you have eyes but fail to see?" Do you fail to see the things that are going on around here? Don't you remember what I have done? And so the third question that he asks out of these 3 series is, don't you remember? Don't you understand? Don't you see? I'm going to tie all 3 of these together, so be patient with me and go along with me for just a second. Here's the 4th one, okay? Matthew chapter 17, verse 20. Matthew chapter 17, verse 20. Here, at the very beginning of this chapter, you have Peter, James, and John who have gone up on the mountain with Jesus, and this is the time of Jesus' transfiguration, where his clothes shine and his face becomes as bright as the sun. And so you have this situation taking place, and these 3 are gone with him. They come down from the mountain, and the other disciples are at the base of the mountain. And it's here that they have had people that have come to them. They've had a crowd, and there's a man who has a son who is possessed by a demon. And the disciples have not been able to cast that demon out. And they ask the question later on, after Jesus cast the demon out, why couldn't we cast the demon out? In verse 20, he replies, because you have so little faith. But if you look at Mark chapter 14, verse 29, he says, this kind can come out only by prayer. Now, I think about the connection of faith and prayer. Your prayer life is reflectant of your faith in God, isn't it? If you pray a lot, it's because you believe that God can do something about what's going on in your life. If you don't pray much, it might be because you lack faith in what God is capable of doing. Right? I need to hear that just as much as anybody, so don't feel like I'm pointing at you by saying that. But I think about these 4 situations. The disciples were men who Jesus called. They were inadequate at times. They struggled. and their journey of faith was one of hardship. But you think about these four situations. Why are you so afraid? Why did you doubt? And the statement in Proverbs is, trust in the Lord your God. You want to have faith? Trust in Him. There's going to be times in our lives where we doubt and where we're afraid of what could happen. Ever been there? I think we all have at times. But the answer to that is trust God. Trust in the Lord. We are on a journey of faith, though, where we need to realize that when we come into situations that we can trust Him. But how does that take place? How do we find ourselves leaning upon Him and trusting in the things that He says? We do that by remembering what He was able to do. Jesus says, don't you remember what I was able to do when I fed the 4,000, when I fed the 5,000? Don't you remember what I'm capable of doing? And so lean upon Him, right? Trust in the Lord. Lean not on your own understanding. Lean on what He says. And then in all your ways acknowledge Him. And that's the fourth one that we see here is, when He heals the boy, He says this kind comes out only by prayer. My connection with prayer in that also is that the disciples have been given the power to heal people, right? To cast out demons, to do all of these things. But the one thing that they forgot to do was rely upon God in the situation. They forgot to ask God to help them to do this. This kind only comes out by prayer. Our journey of faith must be one where we're not afraid, where we don't doubt what God can do. It's also one where we should remember what He's capable of doing. And when we find ourselves in those situations where they're scary and where we're afraid, we give it over to Him and we rely on Him. That's what faith is all about, isn't it? Easily said, not easily done. It's interesting. At the end of Mark chapter 16, verse 14, this is Jesus getting ready to ascend into heaven. He gives the Great Commission to His disciples. But right before He gives that Great Commission, He rebukes His disciples for doubting. They had heard that Jesus had risen from the grave. Many people had seen Jesus. They had come to Jesus and come to the disciples and told them about it, but they doubted. The men that He would entrust with the kingdom, the men that He would entrust with sharing the word with everybody, struggled with faith. It's a journey of faith that each and every one of us is on, where we try to trust in Him and rely on Him, and we remember what He's capable of doing. If you would, open up to one last passage, Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. We read this just right before the sermon. But I think this points us to what we need to do. The chapter before this is the faith chapter. It reminds us of what faith is, and it also points to all of these people who had faith throughout the entire Bible, where they stepped up and they took steps of faith and they did what they were called to do. And he says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, since we're surrounded by all these people throughout the Bible who have taken steps of faith and been on a journey of faith and done what they're supposed to do, let us throw off everything that hinders us and the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with perseverance. Let us run with perseverance. Throw off everything that holds you back, that keeps you from putting your faith in God, keeps you from trusting Him. Get rid of the sin that's in your life and give your life to Him and run the race of perseverance. When you talk about perseverance, you talk about running a race. Perseverance comes in hand when you're running a long-distance race. When you're running a marathon, you need to have perseverance, right? You need to be able to run that long distance. And so you get the stride that will help you to complete that task. But he says, Let us run with perseverance the race that's marked out for us. And then he tells us how to do that in verse 2. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Set your eyes on Jesus. Focus on him. He is the one who created your faith. He is the author and perfecter of faith. It is by him that we can achieve this. And so we look to him, we set our eyes on him, we focus on him on a daily basis, and we make that journey of faith down the road. It's interesting to me how much Proverbs 3 connects to this. And it goes back and forth. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Focus on him. Your path will be straight because you're going to that one destination. Focus on him so that you can get to the place where you're supposed to be going. It's when we begin focusing on the other things around this world that we start going in different directions than what he's called us to. Focus on him. Put your mind on the things that he's called you to. That means you need to be reading his word, praying to him on a daily basis, and trusting that those things will be fulfilled. Journey of faith. That's what it's all about. Taking one step each day, putting him as your focus, and going down that road. This morning, we have the opportunity to be able to come forward. If there's any prayers that we can say for you, if you desire to have a relationship with God, this is the time that you can do that. Will you now come as we stand and sing?